My family has a little vacation home in Florida. My parents are avid skiers, which was the motivating factor behind that purchase. The home has been in the family since before I was born. It's definitely showing its age in a lot of ways, but it's also like 40 years old. It's not going to look new. My dad's had to do a lot of upkeep on the place over the years. It's still in our family today, and it's really on its way out at this point. My dad talks about knocking it down and putting up a new place, but I don't really get involved in his decision. This story takes place like 15 years ago when I was 8 and my brother was 11. We were up in Colorado during a blizzard. The snowfall was insane, and of course, my brother and I had to go out and play in it. The great thing about going up there when we were kids was the sheer amount of space. The property has a huge opening with woods surrounding in all directions. There's a dead-end road that goes downhill which leads to a few more, almost equally big properties. It's the perfect layout for hide-and-seek or snowball fights or any number of games like that. My brother Josh and I went out in our snow gear to play our snowball fight game with our own little custom rules. Basically, we'd set up 2 forts. We could pick our forts to be anywhere, but we had to tell each other where we were picking. We would then make one giant snowball as the so-called jewel that we'd have to successfully steal from the other base and bring back to ours. Josh chose to make his base on the nearest neighboring property. There was almost never a car, like 9 times out of 10 that we'd go there, so we'd often play games on their property too since they were never there. What we'd do is build little walls to emulate a fort, and then put the big snowball behind the walls. So to get to each other's bases in this game, we could either cut through the woods or take the road up or down to get to the opposite fort. Once Josh ran down the road and disappeared, I was supposed to wait for him to blow the whistle to signal that the game began. I waited for a while, like a long while, over 5 minutes. He had already set up his fort by then, so all he had to do was get back down there and blow the whistle. When it hit around maybe the 10-minute mark is when I decided I probably just couldn't hear the whistle from there, so I started plotting my route. Was it better to go through the woods or down the road? I opted for the road because honestly, going through the woods during a blizzard at 8 years old was a scary thought. I started trudging through the unplowed snow on the ground as flakes of snow blew into my face. With the amount of layers my mom made me put on though, I wasn't cold at all. As I approached the driveway to the neighboring property, I looked through the trees and didn't see Josh over there. With all the brush and trees bare in the winter, it was quite easy to see through the woods. So I cut into the property through the trees to kind of sneak in, but Josh was literally nowhere in sight. I saw his fort, so I looked around, and when I could confirm he wasn't anywhere in sight, I approached his fort to grab the jewel. Before I could, I heard a woman's voice yelling out, "Excuse me, are you looking for your brother?" I turned in the direction it came from, and it was an older woman at the front door of the neighbor's house. I called back that we're playing a game. She responded with, "Your brother's in here." I was very confused. I started walking towards the front steps of the house, and as I got closer, the woman's face got clearer. To my 8-year-old mind, she looked a lot older than she probably was. As I got closer to the house, I noticed at one of the upstairs windows, there was someone looking out at me. For a second, I actually thought it was Josh. It was someone with half their face covered, presumably by a black beanie, and the bottom part of their face covered under the bottom of the window. I also noticed another trail of footprints leading to the front door. They had to be Josh's. The woman was giving me a very creepy smile. I remember that feeling of my heart dropping for some reason. She waved me inside to come in and get out of the cold. I stopped dead in my tracks and screamed, "Josh," but there was no response. The woman stopped smiling. She didn't expect me to do that. I also noticed that the other trail of footprints was doubled over. If it was Josh, his footprints turned around and headed back towards the woods. I then heard heavy footsteps from inside the house. They sounded like they were upstairs coming down. I started to run, and the woman screamed something at me or someone else that I didn't understand. I looked back once at the house, and that face that was upstairs at the window before was no longer there. I ran off the property back on the road, running through my previous footsteps. I started to hear my dad's whistling from up the hill, the whistling he'd do to get my brother home at dinner time. When I made back to our driveway, Dad and Josh were there already, having been on their way to get me. Before I could even try to explain what just happened, Josh was already telling me that there were people in the neighbor's house telling him to come inside. I said the same exact thing happened to me, so my dad went down there with some kind of weapon in his hand while we waited in the home with our mom. He came back after a long while and said that the front door was locked and no one was answering, so we went to another neighbor's house, and they knew the owners of the house and they called them. This part still gives me chills whenever my dad mentions what he was told. The owners of that house were not there that weekend. Nobody was supposed to be in the house. The cops were called and everything, and my brother and I did have to speak to one of the officers on scene to describe the woman. After that, we were no longer involved. According to my dad, the back door was unlocked and the house was investigated, which turned up nothing. For this reason, my parents took home any extra valuable things in fear of a break-in while we were gone. After that day, we steered clear of playing on that property, just from the creepiness factor of that memory alone. Thank God we didn't go in that house. I've been skiing for as long as I've been able to walk. My parents used to ski competitively. That's actually how they met. So it was really important to them that my siblings and I learned as early as possible. Fast forward about 20 odd years, and that's how old I am now. This story happened to me a few winters ago when I was 21 years old. I was a senior in college. Everyone knows the best skiing accessible to the Northeast is Vermont. It was going to be a trip like any other. It was me, Jaden, Rylan, and Amir. I can't remember for the life of me what mountain we were skiing that trip, as Jaden had booked the whole thing and Rylan was driving. What I do remember was that it was massive, with like 7 ski lifts covering all the different peaks. If I had to guess, it was Killington. We skied nearly 2 full days, and I'm sure there were still trails we missed. That's how big it was. It was the second day. After skiing the day before, we had a pretty good grasp on the trails we enjoyed, so this day would mostly be about testing ourselves and pushing the limits, as per tradition. I'd also be lying if I said we didn't have a handful of fireball shooters to liven things up. We were having an extremely enjoyable trip. The double blacks never got boring, and racing down each slope was its own little game. We had maybe an hour left until the lifts closed. We were all exhausted, but we knew as soon as we hit the road to head home, we'd instantly miss the mountain again. We were contemplating how we would end the trip at the top of the lift, when 2 girls without their helmets made their way over to us. Now this might sound a little odd to some people, but I wouldn't be doing this story justice if I left out this detail. The girls, one brunette and one blonde, were drop dead gorgeous.
I heard this song already.
Sure that this was a real trail. This whole time. I checked my phone, half an hour until the lifts closed. I tried to come up with some excuse for why we couldn't ski this trail. I knew they wouldn't be able to move that, we would have just woken up robbed, but even that would have been horrible. Something tells me that no one would go to those extremes just to rob some broke college-looking kids. Besides, who really keeps valuables on them when skiing? I guess Amir and Rylan's expensive skis were worth stealing, but it still felt like overkill of nature all to yourself. The photos always turn out great too, which is a huge plus for a couple of edgy guys like us. This happened this past winter. It's April as I'm writing this, so about 4 months ago now. I know what you're probably thinking, but don't worry, none of us fell through the ice. That's not what this story is about. It was snowing pretty heavily that night, which was the main reason we decided to go. It had been consistently below freezing for a couple of weeks too, so we were relatively confident the lake was completely frozen over. I'd personally take winter over summer any day of the week. I bet all my friends would agree. There are about 1 million reasons why, but one of them is as simple as the snowfall itself. First of all, it's just pretty. What I like most about it, though, is that you'll never find yourself in complete darkness. Even after sunset, the world isn't entirely dark. The light reflecting off the white snow blends day and night, so you're left with this really surreal feeling that doesn't arise from anything else. The moon was also pretty full that night, so that feeling was amplified. Kyle was driving that night. He had a pickup that handled pretty well in the snow, so we just played it safe and let him drive, even though Ricky was usually the one who chauffeured us around. The lake itself is surrounded by a thin forest, so we couldn't actually drive all the way to the water's edge. I don't think forest is the right word. It's really just a cluster of sparsely scattered trees, but it's more than enough to prevent a car from driving through. We parked in a nearby lot and got out of the car. It was freezing out. The 3 of us bundled up and walked toward the lake. I didn't smoke at the time, I still don't, but Ricky and Kyle both do, so they lit a couple of cigarettes as we walked. I think it was after midnight, but I can't say for sure. All I remember is that there wasn't a soul out there. Not an animal, not a person, nothing. No movement whatsoever besides the three of us. We reached the lake, and as we anticipated, it seemed completely frozen over. The three of us were laughing about something stupid when Kyle picked up a small boulder and chucked it onto the ice, testing its integrity. It didn't even crack, so we took that as an indication to make our way towards the middle of the lake. We obviously didn't go super far on the ice, that would have been careless, but we did venture a decent ways away from the ledge. We were maybe 100 feet out when something caught our attention. On the far side of the lake, near the edge where the trees bordered the ice, something big and dark was moving. We stopped talking immediately. We just stopped in our tracks, watching. Whatever it was large, hunched over, and moving slowly toward the lake. Finally, we realized what we were looking at. It was a bear. Ricky was the first to say something. He whispered, "Is that a bear?" as quietly as he could. I didn't answer. My heart was already racing. If it was a bear, the last thing we wanted to do was draw its attention. We stood there, frozen, not even daring to breathe too loudly. But then, as the figure moved closer, something felt off. The way it walked wasn't quite right. Too upright. Too human. It also looked like there was something dragging behind it. Nothing about it made sense. It was one of the most bizarre things I'd ever seen. And that's when it straightened up completely, and we realized the truth all at once. It wasn't a bear. It was a person. A person wearing some kind of bear suit. Kyle said, "What the hell," in a low voice, and I was thinking the same exact thing. I know it doesn't sound scary in a generic sense, but if you had been there, you would have been terrified too. I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I don't know if I was more afraid or confused, but something told me to stay quiet. The figure kept moving toward the ice, dragging something behind him. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. The snow blurred the details, but as he got closer, I realized he was holding a rope that was attached to the thing he was dragging, and a few moments later, we could see it more clearly. It was a small black bag. It looked like a smaller sized garbage bag, if they even made those. Either way, it was chilling. We stood there, unsure of what to do. My mind was screaming at me to turn around and leave, but my body felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I don't think Ricky and Kyle were too keen on turning around and leaving either, because neither one of them flinched. I probably wouldn't have left right then, even if I hadn't been so scared. I needed to know what that person was doing. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any stranger, the man unzipped and stepped out of the bear suit. Seeing him as a person didn't make things any better. He wasn't particularly large or intimidating, but there was something unsettling about him. We watched as he bent down, presumably to pick up a rock, but I couldn't tell from so far away. And then the sounds started. He knelt down, holding what looked like a rock, and began repeatedly slamming it into the ice. It might have been placebo, but I swear I could feel the vibration in the ice even from the distance. He was trying to break through, most likely to dispose of whatever was in that bag. Ricky tapped my shoulder, and I turned to see him and Kyle moving back towards solid ground. Without a word, I followed suit, and the three of us tried to move quickly without making too much noise. Every step felt deafening in the quiet, even though I knew there was no way that guy could hear the crunch of snow from that far away. We barely made it a few yards when a voice yelled out, "Hey," from behind us. I didn't even look back. I just started running, praying that guy didn't have a gun. The cold didn't help. I found myself starting to get winded after not even a minute of running. I don't know if he followed. I don't think he did, but in that moment, we were in full-on panic mode. We reached the edge of the lake, and at that point, I was gasping for breath. After a very short break, we made our way back to the car silently, and Kyle drove off immediately. None of us had any idea what we had just seen. Kyle said it was probably someone dumping their trash, but I told him that was ridiculous. Who in their right mind would dress up in a bear suit in the middle of the winter to illegally dump their trash? There was no way. Ricky said it was definitely someone dumping a body, but I told him the bag was way too small for that. The three of us talked about it the whole ride home, but we couldn't agree on a definite explanation. We never got an answer. The reason I'm thinking about this now is because my mom was watching TV the other day and an old missing persons report popped up on the screen. It was a child from around our area, and the timeline of his disappearance matched up pretty closely with what we had seen on that lake. I'm not jumping to conclusions. I know it's a long shot and probably just an unfortunate coincidence, but I can't help but wonder if those two things are somehow related. By the time you're hearing this, we've probably reported our sighting to the police. I moved to South Dakota about 5 years ago. It was the first time I'd ever lived alone, and honestly, it was long overdue. My parents had been on my case for years about getting out of the house, and I finally caved. I'm not exactly a social butterfly, so the idea of living somewhere secluded actually appealed to me. The house I found was in one of the snowier parts of the state, tucked away on a stretch of land where the nearest neighbor was a solid walk away. That was fine by me. For the most part, that's exactly what I got. The first few years were uneventful in the best way possible. I kept to myself, went to work, came home, and didn't bother anyone. I never introduced myself to any of the neighbors, partly because I'm just not that kind of person, and partly because there wasn't much of a compelling reason to do so. The houses out there are so spread apart that you could go weeks without seeing another soul. Everything changed one afternoon in early February. I was at work when the snow started coming down. At first, it was nothing unusual, but within an hour, it had escalated into something else entirely. The wind picked up, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the roads started getting dangerous. My boss eventually told everyone to head home before conditions got any worse. I drive a lifted truck, so I wasn't too worried about making it back. I've driven through plenty of bad weather before, and the truck has always handled it well. Still, there were certain sections of the drive that had me a little concerned. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, I was just relieved to be home. But when I went to unlock my front door, I realized it was frozen solid. I stood there for a second, processing what was happening, then tried again, but it wouldn't budge. I didn't have a lighter on me, or anything else that could generate enough heat to thaw the mechanism. I tried breathing on it, cupping my hands around it, even banging on it a few times out of frustration. None of it worked. I walked back to my truck and sat there, not sure what to do. The heater was blasting, and I told myself I'd just wait out the storm. Maybe it would die down in an hour or two, and I could figure something out. But as I sat there watching through the windshield, the snow only seemed to fall harder. After maybe 10 minutes, I realized I was making a mistake. The longer I waited, the worse things were going to get. My truck was already half buried, and even with the lift, I doubted I'd be able to get back out of the driveway. So now, driving wasn't even an option anymore. I didn't have anyone to call. I didn't know any of my neighbors, and my parents were hours away. I tried to drive the truck out of there, but like I suspected, it was stuck. My only real option was to walk to one of the neighboring houses and ask for help. I hated the idea of it, showing up at some stranger's door asking them to take me in, but I didn't have another choice. Staying in my truck all night wasn't going to work. The gas would eventually run out, and then I'd be sitting in a freezing metal box in the middle of a blizzard. The closest house was still pretty far away, probably a quarter mile or so. By the time I reached it, I was shivering uncontrollably. It was a tiny one-story house, and even through the blowing snow, I could tell it was in rough shape. I knocked on the front door as loud as I could. I waited for a good minute. I was just about to turn away and try the next house, when the door swung open so violently, I actually took a step back. The man standing there looked around 50 years old, with a very nondescript face. He looked at me for a second without saying anything, then introduced himself as Joe. I explained my situation and he nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in. I should have felt relieved, but something about him felt off from the start. It was hard to pinpoint at first. The house was warm, which was all I really cared about in the moment. He offered me a seat on the couch and sat across from me in a worn-out armchair. We made small talk for a few minutes, or at least I tried to. He answered my questions, but his attention seemed to be somewhere else entirely. His eyes kept darting around the room, From me to the floor to the ceiling to somewhere over his shoulder. It was like he couldn't focus on any one thing for more than a few seconds. At first, I thought maybe he was just nervous about having a stranger in his house. That would have been understandable, but the longer we sat there, the more unsettled I became. He couldn't focus on the conversation either. He'd be mid-sentence and then just trail off, staring at a spot in the wall like he was looking through it. I decided I wanted as little interaction with this guy as possible. I told him I was exhausted and asked if I could just get some sleep. He seemed almost relieved by the suggestion and pointed to the couch, saying I could crash there for the night. I asked if we could turn out the light, and he flicked off the lamp without argument. But he didn't leave. He just stood in the
Hmm.
doorway for what felt like a full minute, not saying anything, not even moving. I lay on the couch with my eyes half closed, trying to look like I was already drifting off. Eventually, after this long, uncomfortable pause, he finally receded down the hallway toward what I assumed was his bedroom. I really did try to sleep. I was exhausted, and the couch was actually more comfortable than I expected. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I started to drift off and then jolt awake, convinced I heard something. About an hour in, I actually did start hearing things. It took me a few seconds to realize that the thumping and scraping sounds were coming from above me. At first, I told myself it was just snow shifting on the roof. That happens all the time in heavy storms. But these sounds were different, somehow. That didn't make any sense, though. The house was one story. There was no upstairs floor for anyone to be walking around on. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The sounds continued for several minutes, sporadic but persistent. And then, without warning, there was a thump that was considerably louder than all the previous ones. It was so sudden and so forceful that I shot upright on the couch, and as soon as I sat up, I saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. He must have been there for a while, just watching me in the dark, because I hadn't heard him come back. My skin started feeling itchy. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could get a word out, he literally charged at me.
Oh no.
He jumped over the back of the couch and tackled me to the floor. The next few seconds were pure chaos. We rolled around on the carpet, and I realized he was trying to put me in a chokehold. He was stronger than he looked, and for a moment, I thought I wasn't going to be able to get him off. I kept resisting, and he started yelling. He screamed at me to stop fighting. He kept referencing this her, like I was supposed to know what he was talking about. He said she was lonely, and something about how she would find me good company. I wasn't thinking about that, though. I was fighting for my life. I finally managed to get enough leverage to shove him off me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my coat, and ran for the front door. I didn't even put my coat on. I was too terrified to waste any more time. Behind me, I heard that crazy fuck scream something. I'm pretty sure he said, "She's not gonna be happy," or some insane shit along those lines. I ran and didn't stop until I reached the next house. The family who answered the door were normal people, a husband and wife from the looks of it. They took one look at me and pulled me inside. Slept on the couch that night. The next morning, I woke up to the wife, who introduced herself as Kathy. She was making everyone coffee. The three of us sat at the kitchen table, and I told them what happened. As soon as I described the house, the husband, whose name was Brandon, interrupted me. He asked if it was Joe. I said yes, and he just nodded, like he wasn't surprised at all. He told me that Joe had been a problem in the area for years, but then he told me something that gave my skin that itchy feeling again. About a decade earlier, Joe's wife had disappeared. There was never any official investigation. Nothing was ever proven, but most people in the area suspected he killed her. The body was never found. I immediately connected the dots, but kept my mouth shut for whatever reason. I still have no idea why I didn't speak up. I did end up reporting my experience to the police, but I don't think they ever did anything to deal with it. The scariest part is that I still live in the same house 3 years later. Nothing has happened since that night in the blizzard, but I'd be lying if I said I don't get a weird feeling every time I drive past Joe's house. The one silver lining to all of this is that I got close with the family who took me in that night, but I always get a weird feeling every time I go over there, because it reminds me of Joe and whatever god-awful thing he's done to his wife. This happened last winter during one of the worst blizzards I can remember. I'm 27 and live alone in a small rental house in upstate New York. I work remotely and find it
Close to home,
easier
man.
than it is. Mostly, I just sit at my desk and stare at spreadsheets all day. The point is, I rarely have a reason to leave the house during the week. Some weeks, I don't leave at all. News has been hyping up this blizzard for days. You know how they get. Every storm is potentially historic or life threatening until it dumps 3 inches and everyone moves on. But this one actually looks serious. The weather alerts were telling people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary, stock up on essentials, all that. So I went grocery shopping that morning, grabbing enough food to last me through the weekend, and then I settled in for what I assumed would be a boring few days of working from home. The snow started in the mid-afternoon, and by around 8 p.m., I could barely see past my front porch. I
Excuse
spent
me.
most of the evening on my couch, half watching TV and half listening to the wind howl outside. It's a specific kind of sound, wind during a blizzard, not like a summer storm where it comes and goes. This was constant, like the house was inside a tunnel. At around 10:30, I heard a new sound. It was kind of like a loud thud, followed by this dragging sound, sort of like something heavy being pulled across wood. I figured a tree branch had come down. There are a few old oaks near my driveway, and with all that snow and wind, it wouldn't be surprising if one of them dropped a limb. About 15 minutes later, though, I heard a car horn. It wasn't a normal honk. It was weak and intermittent, almost like someone had tapped the horn on accident. I went to my front window and looked out. There was a vehicle stopped near the end of my driveway. I could see its headlights cutting through the snow, but that was about it. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting to see if anyone could get out, but I couldn't make out any movement. With the storm the way it was, I couldn't even tell what kind of car it was. My first thought was that someone had slid off the road. It happens out there, especially in weather like that. It sounds callous, but I wasn't about to trudge out into a blizzard to check on a stranger, not when I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on something else. At around 11, I heard knocking at my front door. I didn't open the door. Instead, I walked over and called out, asking who was there. A man's voice answered. He said his car was stuck and he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. His voice
No.
sounded strained, like he was out of breath. Part of me felt guilty. If this guy really had been walking through that storm, he probably was freezing. But another part of me still wasn't fully ready to just open my door to a stranger in the middle of the night. Instead of opening the door fully, I cracked it, making sure to keep the security chain locked. The man on my porch was covered in snow, like to a laughable extent. It was caked on his shoulders, his hair. He was shorter than me, and he was visibly shivering. He said his phone had died and that he'd been walking for some time, trying to find a house with lights on. I was just about to open the door when I noticed his boots. I don't know what made me look down, but I did. And here's the thing. His boots were clean. Like, clean and dry, too. If this guy had really been walking through a blizzard for any length of time, his boots should have been caked with snow and ice as well. Hell, mine get like that just walking to my car. I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. I told him again that I would call for help and make sure someone came for him. He asked me to be let in again, more firmly this time. I didn't respond. I just closed the door and locked it. I could hear him say something on the other side, but I was already walking to get my phone. I called 911 and explained the situation. While I was on the line with the operator, I heard footsteps move from my porch to the side of my house, toward the back. The operator told me to stay inside and keep all the doors locked. She said police were being dispatched, but warned me that response times might be delayed because of the weather. I moved to a side window and peeked out, not wanting him to see me. The man was standing near the corner of my house, maybe 15 feet away. He wasn't moving, he was just standing there looking up at the windows. A few minutes later, I heard banging on my back door. Like someone was trying to break through. The whole door was shaking in its frame. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and retreated to my bedroom. I locked the door behind me and stood a few feet from the door. The banging stopped after maybe a minute. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like hours, but it was probably closer to 20 minutes.
At some point, I heard the car horn again, the same one from earlier, but this time it was one long, continuous honk. Luckily, the police arrived shortly after that. They found a vehicle partially buried in a snowbank, but it was further down the road than where I'd seen the headlights. The engine was cold when they checked it, not warm like it would have been if someone had recently been driving it. Here's the part that still gets me. The officers told me there were no footprints leading from the vehicle to my house. Apparently the snow was undisturbed between the car and my property. There were footsteps leading down my driveway and round my house, but they stopped at the driveway like someone had been driving a separate car. The police searched the area but didn't find anyone. The next morning, after the storm had passed and the sun was out, I went outside to look around. To my horror, there were muddy handprints on the exterior of my bedroom window, which definitely hadn't been there when the police searched the property. It was like the person had come back after they had left, or had been hiding and never left in the first place. A few days later, I found out that another house about half a mile away had been broken into during the storm. The homeowner wasn't there at the time, so no one was hurt. But the strange part was that nothing was reported stolen. Whoever broke in didn't take anything. Why anyone would break into a house during a blizzard and not even steal anything is beyond me. It's almost like whoever did wasn't trying to rob the place, but do something else. I know the whole incident doesn't sound that scary, but I can't help but feel like whoever was trying to get into my house, probably the same person that broke into the other house, was there to do something sinister. I'm just glad I didn't open my door. This happened several years ago now. I have told maybe 3 people about it. My wife, my brother, and one close friend who I knew wouldn't think I was losing my mind. I'm telling it here because I still don't have an explanation, and at this point, I've accepted that I probably never will. I'm 34, and I live in British Columbia. For most of my 20s, I was a professional skier, alpine racing mostly. I competed nationally for about 6 years before my body started telling me it was time to stop. Nothing dramatic like a career-ending injury or anything, just the accumulation of wear and tear that happens. I stepped away from competition when I was 26, which felt like the right call at the time and still does. But retiring from competitive skiing doesn't mean you stop skiing. If anything, it freed me up to do the kind of skiing I actually loved. Backcountry stuff, away from the resorts and crowds. I say all this not to brag, but to establish that I knew what I was doing out there. I was avalanche trained, certified in wilderness first aid, and familiar with every protocol you're supposed to follow when you're skiing alone in remote terrain. I'd done dozens of solo trips in the backcountry without incident. The plan that day was simple. I was going to hit a remote range a few hours north of where I lived. I'd skied before, actually. The weather forecast was calling for light snowfall, maybe a few inches, but nothing that would prevent a day trip. I checked the avalanche conditions the night before, and again that morning. Everything looked manageable. I got to the mountain just after sunrise, strapped on my gear, and started skidding uphill. The snowfall started picking up while I was climbing, which wasn't unusual, but the wind had changed too. It was coming from a different direction than the forecast had predicted, and it was stronger than it should have been. Visibility was also dropping much faster than I was comfortable with. The smart move would have been to just turn around immediately, but I was already at the top of a line I'd been looking forward to all week. I told myself just one run and then I'd call it.
Trying to connect my
I've made that decision 1,000 times since then.
into us.
Yes, I know it was stupid. I know experienced people die all the time in the backcountry because they make exactly the kind of call I made that day. I knew it then too, but I did it anyway. The descent started fine. The pitch was manageable, and I was skiing conservatively just to be extra safe. About 2/3 of the way down the mountain, though, the worst possible thing happened. If you've never been caught in an avalanche, it's hard to describe how fast it happens. 1 second you're in control, the next you're just not. It's not the same thing as wiping out or even catching an edge. The snow moves, and you have no choice but to move with it. I got lucky. The avalanche wasn't big, probably a class 2. Which was enough to knock me off my skis, but not enough to bury me. I tumbled maybe 30 or 40 yards before I slammed into something solid. Slammed as in instant deceleration. I don't even know what it was. Rocks probably, or maybe a tree buried under the snowpack.
Hmm.
All I remember in that moment was the feeling in my left leg. I remember just lying there, trying to convince myself everything was all right, but it wasn't. My skis had released. That was good. That's what you're supposed to do. But one of them had tumbled further downhill, and I had no idea where it ended up. I tried to stand and immediately collapsed. The pain in my leg was unimaginable. I can't even begin to describe it. I managed to get myself into a sitting position and took stock of the situation. The snow was still seemingly getting worse, too, which meant I was likely in the opening moments of a blizzard. But the worst part was obviously my leg. I couldn't put much weight on it, which meant I couldn't ski out even if I found my other ski. My options were limited. I had 3 choices. 2 of them were suicide, and the third wasn't much better. I could stay where I was and hope someone came looking for me, but only one person knew where I was that day, and he wouldn't have assumed something was wrong with me. I could try to dig and wait out the storm, but I didn't have the support overnight, and the temperature was dropping. Or I could start moving, painfully and slowly, to try and cover as much ground as possible before conditions got even worse. I chose to move. It's not like I had much of a choice. I secured what was left of my gear and started limping downhill, using the one pole that was miraculously still in my hand as a makeshift crutch. Every step sent pain shooting through my leg, but I had to keep moving. As for the snow, my prediction turned out to be correct. It only got worse, and at that point it was falling so heavily that I could barely see. I was ignoring the pain in my leg, focusing on moving as fast as I could, and wondering whether I was going to die out there, when I heard something behind me. At first, I thought the adrenaline was finally getting to my head and overwhelming my brain. That was genuinely my first thought, that I was becoming delirious in my final moments before passing out. But I turned around anyway, and what I saw confirmed that I was hallucinating. There was another skier moving downhill toward me. I can't describe it, but seeing him emerging from the snow filled me with an emotion that has no word. I was skeptical as to whether what I was seeing was even real, simultaneously relieved and terrified that there was another person out there, and something else. It was fear, but for what, I didn't know. He reached me within a few minutes. He was alone and backcountry equipped like me. He pulled off his helmet to readjust his goggles and asked if I was hurt, and I told him what happened. Without wasting a second, he moved up to my side and let me put my arm around his shoulder. We started moving together. Like I said before, I felt something that I couldn't explain. There was something beyond the adrenaline, pain, relief, and confusion. It didn't feel like a normal interaction. It felt like he hadn't stumbled upon me by accident, as crazy as that sounds. We talked about the basic stuff, most of which I don't remember, but there was one thing he said that stayed with me for whatever reason. He told me he hadn't used his legs in a long time, and it was nice to get back on solid ground. I didn't really know what he meant by that. I assumed he was talking in some ski jargon I didn't know. I laughed and we kept going. At one point, I had to stop. I remember this exact moment like it was yesterday. I leaned against a tree and closed my eyes for literally 4 seconds, and when I opened them, he was gone. There was no one there, but unless he buried himself in the snow, there was really nowhere for anyone to go either. I yelled for him, what else was I gonna do? But no one called back. I started
This is like the hardest
the area,
part.
thinking maybe he had gotten buried. Nothing. It gets worse though. There were no tracks in the snow other than my own. I started freaking out. He'd been right there, right next to me, supporting half my weight for what must have been like an hour, but there was nothing. I started feeling dizzy, like someone had just punched me in the gut, and the feeling I had been feeling earlier came back. The rational part of my brain was insisting there had to be an explanation. Could I have been more disoriented than I thought? Maybe the snow had filled in his tracks faster than mine. Or maybe I had hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe I was already dead. I didn't have time to figure it out. The storm wasn't going to wait for me to process what had happened. I don't know how I made it back to my car. The last mile or so was such a blur. Just pain and cold and the stubborn refusal to stop moving. But I did eventually make it. I drove myself to the hospital and finally got some good news. The doctor told me my leg was severely sprained but not broken. They told me I got incredibly lucky. Fast forward to a few days later, and I'm still recovering at home, but I can't stop thinking about one thing. That other skier, where he'd come from, where he'd gone, why there hadn't been any tracks. I kept telling myself I'd figure it out eventually, but I think that was mostly wish casting. I was combing through some local skier-centric website, something I do often, and that's when I stumbled upon something terrifying. It was a story about a fatal backcountry skiing incident, a man who'd been lost in a storm a few weeks prior. It had happened on the same mountain range, and authorities hadn't been able to find a body. The worst had been assumed. There were no photographs of the man on the article, and when I searched up his name, I didn't find any Facebook or Instagram profiles or anything of the nature, so I can't compare the man I saw on the mountain to the man in the article, but it's still a chilling coincidence nonetheless. I choose to believe the shock and hypothermia were causing me to hallucinate, and my memory playing tricks on me. Maybe my brain constructed something to convince me that I wasn't alone on the mountain, but I remember his shoulder under my arm. I remember feeling him helping me down the mountain. There's no way I could have moved that fast by myself. I still ski, but I haven't gone alone since then. I still have no idea what helped me off that mountain. "3 years ago, my partner and I bought our first home. It was a modest place, and our neighbors were wonderful. Life was good. So good, in fact, that 18 months later, when those neighbors decided to sell their house, which was larger and had more luxuries like a driveway, a garage, and a bathtub, we jumped at the chance. We bought their house and put our old one right next door up for sale. After reading several motivation letters from potential buyers, we chose a Polish couple. They only spoke in English to us and not in Dutch like we did, but everything seemed normal. They asked for some tips about the house, and we had some pleasant, small-scale small talk. But looking back, that was the calm before the storm. Even before the big incidents, things felt off. We started experiencing bizarre disturbances at the strangest hours. Sometimes at midnight, we'd hear heavy banging or incredibly loud music blasting through the walls without warning. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to make us feel like we didn't truly know who was living a few feet away. The first red flag appeared when the neighbor came home with severe damage to both sides of his car. It looked like he had scraped against a guardrail at high speed on both sides. When we asked what happened, he gave a clumsy excuse: a concrete pole on one side and a trailer taking a turn too wide on the other. We chose to believe him, even though the math didn't add up. One evening around 6 p.m., the neighbor called us in a total panic. He claimed people were outside his house, turning his security cameras away. He begged us to check it out and call the police. We looked, and sure enough, 2 men were breaking in. We called the cops immediately. It took the cops 20 minutes to arrive, so the burglars were already gone. The neighbor's wife came racing into the street, parked her car, and frantically ran inside to her sweet little French bulldog, and the police, who were at the time already there. When I was walking my dog curiously, I saw the husband park his car 3 streets away and walk to the scene, as if he was hiding the vehicle from the police. But that thought didn't occur to me at the moment. Later, when we checked the doorbell footage, we saw the burglars standing there before the break-in, calmly discussing which house to target in Polish. Nothing was stolen, no one was caught. I told the police it felt like a setup, but I never heard back. A week later, I was at a housewarming party when my partner texted me, "The music next door is insanely loud again." A few minutes later, he called me, and his tone changed to pure terror. The neighbor's car had just come tearing through our front garden and slammed into the neighbor's own front door. 2 men were frantically loading the car with high-end electronics, like flat-screen TVs, professional speakers, and other expensive gear. They looked like the same men from the week before. This time, the police were a lot quicker. They arrived in exactly 7 minutes. The officers intercepted the men while they were still loading the car. When asked for ID, the men claimed they didn't have any. Then things got surreal. The man behind the wheel looked the officer in the eye and claimed to be my neighbor using my neighbor's actual name. But there was a catch. In the 9 months that they lived next to us, my neighbor had never spoken a single word of Dutch. This man, however, spoke fluent Dutch with a thick Polish accent. Realizing the game was up, the men slammed the car into gear, and a violent pursuit followed through our quiet streets until the police managed to box them in and arrest them. But my partner could still hear movement inside our neighbor's house. The police went back in and dragged out a third suspect. As we were inside our own home with an officer to report the damage to our property, the doorbell rang. We turned around, and there he was, the actual neighbor. He was unrecognizable. His face was a swollen, bloody mess. One eye was swollen shut, his mouth was torn, and his arm hung at a useless angle, covered in what looked like defensive stab wounds. He looked feral, aggressive, and broken. The police officer tried to intervene, but the neighbor flat out refused to file a report or cooperate. Since the victim wouldn't speak, the officer had no choice but to send him back to his house. Later that night, the neighbor rang our bell again. He was trembling. He confessed that he cheated on his wife, and he claimed that she had sent people to take him out. He begged to sleep at our house. Terrified and wanting no part of this underworld drama, we refused. My partner would drive him to the hospital instead. We dropped him off at 10:30 p.m., telling him we were staying elsewhere for the night because we no longer felt safe. But we didn't stay elsewhere. We went home, locked every door, and tried to breathe. At around 1 a.m., our dog started growling. A specific low growl he only uses when someone's at the door. We checked the doorbell camera, and there he was. The neighbor was back from the hospital, standing on our porch, ringing the doorbell multiple times. We sat in the dark, watching the screen in silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a car turned onto the street. The neighbor panicked. He scrambled off the porch and hid behind our cars in the driveway, crouching in the shadows. Watching this bloodied, broken man lurking in the dark behind our own cars was one of the most unsettling things I've ever seen. The car stopped, and a woman got out. It was his wife. She walked toward her front door, paused, and glanced at our driveway. She saw him. We held our breath, waiting for a confrontation, or worse. She walked toward him, and as she stepped into the pale yellow glow of the street lamp, she began to wail. A haunting, guttural crying. He didn't say a word, and she kept asking questions, her sobbing getting louder and louder, echoing through the empty street. Eventually, they both got into the car and drove away. We didn't see
What the fuck?
We didn't even know where their dog was. The wife eventually returned alone. She found the dog inside, and she told us she doesn't think she'll ever see her husband again. Whatever the real story is, drugs, debt, or marriage turned lethal, I've realized one thing. I don't think I want to know.
Hair is doing the scratchy stuff is
This all started back in 2017.
giving me a
I
headache.
moved into a new house in the suburbs of Montreal, Canada, with my parents and little sister. Before I get into the juicy part of the story, I need to explain a few details about my room and its placement in the house for everything to make sense from my point of view. The house we moved into is a split-level home, meaning it has staggered floor levels connected by short flights of stairs. My room was neither on the main floor nor in the basement. It sat exactly in between the two, at ground level. One wall
Thought I did this on a different layer.
the opposite side had a large window that looked out into the backyard. At the time, that window had plastic vertical blinds with several missing panels, so even when they were fully closed, I could still see outside through the gaps. On the garage side of my room was my closet, which had large sliding mirror doors. This meant that when I was in bed, no matter which side I faced, I could always see my window reflected back at me. I started noticing things about a year after we moved in, when I was 15. I remember watching YouTube videos on my tablet late at night since I had trouble falling asleep. One night, I heard something outside my window. I had left it open because it was really hot and we hadn't invested in an AC unit yet, so I relied on whatever breeze I could get. After hearing what sounded like footsteps or shuffling, I quickly paused my video and put the tablet down. The noise stopped along with the video, which made me think it had just been part of what I was watching, or maybe my imagination. I resumed the video and heard it again. I looked to my left toward the window, but didn't see anything. So I eventually fell asleep. For a few nights, nothing happened. But then one night, a couple nights later, during my usual late-night YouTube and show watching routine, I heard the shuffling again. I paused what I was watching and listened, this time longer than before. I swear I could hear breathing now, too. I glanced at my window, but again, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, and turned to face my closet instead. As I picked my tablet back up to resume the video, I saw something move at my window through one of the gaps in the blinds, reflected in the mirror. A chill ran down my spine. I got up immediately and went to wake up my parents, deciding it was better to be safe than sorry. What I had seen and heard, and even though my dad clearly doubted me, he went outside to check the backyard. A few minutes later, he came back saying he had checked every corner and didn't see anything. He told me that if someone had been there, he would have heard them come in through the squeaky gate, or he at least would have heard them leave. He also checked the Ring camera, which showed no one walking around the house toward the backyard. I suggested that the person could have jumped the fence into the neighbor's yard, but he quickly shut that down, saying we lived in a safe neighborhood, and that I should stop watching scary movies. Unfortunately, I believed him and went back to bed. Every couple of weeks or months after that, I'd hear things again. Each time, I convinced myself it was all in my head and tried to focus on my videos or fall asleep. When winter came and everything was covered in snow, it stopped, and I eventually forgot about it. But the following year, it started again. It didn't happen often, once or twice a month at most, and always past 11 p.m. I tried not to pay attention to it, even when the noises sounded like clear footsteps or deep breathing. I watched a lot of scary movies and videos, so I kept telling myself that had to be the reason. I avoided looking at the window altogether, even though I tried to believe it was all in my head. Part of me was terrified of being proven wrong. One night, against my better judgment, I looked. Not directly at the window, that was too scary. I looked at the mirror instead. This time, I swear I saw the silhouette of a person. I ran upstairs again, and once again, after checking the entire backyard, my dad told me the same thing he had the year before. And once again, I believed him. This went on for a while. I started going to bed earlier, watching videos louder or with headphones, and completely avoiding my mirror, or worse, looking directly at my window. It always stopped when the weather got colder and started again in mid-spring. One night in early December of 2021, there was a huge windstorm. I was watching a stream with my boyfriend over Discord when I decided to grab a glass of water around 11:30 p.m. On my way, I noticed my parents sitting in the living room. It caught me off guard since they rarely stayed up that late, let alone outside their bedroom. Their faces looked tense and preoccupied. I asked if everything was okay, but they brushed it off, assuring me it was nothing. I assumed I had walked in on a conversation not meant for my ears and headed back toward my room. As I turned toward the stairs, flashes of red and blue light caught my attention through the front window. A police car was pulling into our driveway. My parents immediately stood up as if they'd been expecting it, and they rushed me to my room, telling me they'd call me if needed. I wanted answers, but I knew it wasn't time to push, so I went back to my room, curiosity eating away at me. Not even 2 minutes later, I was called back upstairs. This time, they didn't keep me in the dark. My dad explained that about 15 to 20 minutes earlier, during the windstorm, he had stepped into the backyard to make sure nothing had been blown over before going to bed. While scanning the yard, he noticed the light from my bedroom window illuminating something near it. As his eye adjusted, he realized it was a man standing motionless just outside my window, staring in. My dad yelled at him and started moving toward him, but the man immediately turned and ran. He jumped the back fence effortlessly, as if he'd done it 100 times before, and he disappeared into the neighboring yards. In that moment, Everything I had feared for years stopped being a possibility and became a fact. I hadn't imagined it. Someone really had been there. Terrified, my parents called the police right away, and then went to knock on the neighbor's door to warn her. The older woman who lived there didn't open the door. Instead, she yelled at them to leave or she would call the cops herself. The police eventually arrived, but since my dad hadn't gotten a clear look at the man, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the area and recommending we install more cameras, which we did. In retrospect, my back neighbor's reaction still feels deeply suspicious to me. Why was her first response to threaten my parents when all they did was knock on her door to warn her? It raises a couple questions, such as, was she living with that man my dad saw? Or had she seen him too and genuinely thought it was him knocking? Did I know the person who stood outside my window for years, or was it just some creepy neighbor who noticed a teenage girl's room with poorly covered blinds and took advantage of it? Did he only want to watch, or was he working up to something else? Even now, those questions haunt me. Knowing that someone was really there the entire time makes every sound I brushed off, every breath I thought I imagined, and every silhouette I forced myself not to look at feel so much more terrifying. I've since switched rooms and can't look at windows facing our backyard the same way anymore. Thank God mine now faces the street. What scares me the most isn't that it happened, it's how long it went on for, without anyone knowing, and how easily it could have continued. It was a cold winter day in mid-December, and I was 15 years old. I originally lived in a suburban area of Alberta with my parents in our apartment. However, we were running low on space, and with my little sister on her way, we knew we had to move to a bigger house. It seemed lucky for us at first, because there was a house just a few blocks down that was selling for a very cheap price tag. Granted, it wasn't the best looking or in the best area, but it had room to grow in. And for the price we paid, we could renovate to our heart's content. My dad did renovate slightly with the money we had left, but mainly the basement, as it was almost unusable without being fixed up. Cleaning, carpeting, new beams, fixing the bathroom, and fresh wallpaper with a cool pattern I got to choose myself. For the first couple of months, living there had been great, and I was really enjoying the new house. Until the first questionable moment came along. It was my father's birthday, and to celebrate, we all had gone to a restaurant in the evening. All went well until we came home to our front door wide open. My mom was absolutely shaken, and we begged my dad to drive us away from the house while she called the police. My dad grabbed a large, heavy wrench from his toolbox in the truck and went into the house to search for the intruder. My mom and I called the cops anyway, and we sat there for 5 excruciatingly long minutes before they arrived. They searched the house and found my dad, and he came back out and told us nothing was actually stolen, and no one was in the house either. However, some of our items were moved or knocked over, specifically the books on my bookshelf. The police eventually finished their search and told us the same thing. We were still a little paranoid, but finally, we went inside our home. From that day forward, I would always hear strange noises coming from the walls, and sometimes underneath our basement. Might I add, my room was there, in the basement, but I always dismissed the sounds as the pipes. This was an older house after all. That was until one night, something unexplainable happened. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was playing with my Nintendo DS under the sheets with no volume so my parents didn't know I was still awake. That's when I heard it. Clear coming from the wall to the side of my bed. My heart froze in time, and my eyes probably widened to the size of plates. I didn't know what I should do. Ignore it? Call my parents? Go investigate? I decided to wait for a while to see if it happened again. But after about 30 minutes of laying still as a stone, I decided it must have just been my sleep-deprived imagination, and finally went to sleep. I woke up the next morning in my bed. As usual, nothing changed. Despite that laugh still burning in my mind, I tried to pass it off. I would still hear the same strange noises every so often for the next couple of weeks, but that felt normal for me now. This is when the next occurrence happens. By this time, my sister was already born, and since the basement was big enough, plus my mom trusted me with keeping her safe at night, she shared the room with me. Now, this doesn't mean my mom didn't use baby monitors, because she did. She kept the parent units in the living room, and the other in the kitchen. One night, my parents had gone out for a late-night dinner and left me to take care of the house until they got back. I was in the living room watching a movie when I got up to get a snack from the kitchen. That's when I noticed odd noises coming from the baby monitor. And my heart sank. I knew no one else was home, but those were footsteps. Loud, heavy footsteps. Suddenly, my fear was realized when my sister started crying, and I heard a faint shh sound come out of the speaker, followed by a crash. I instantly did the first thing that came to mind, which now, thinking clearly in retrospect, could have gotten us both killed. I ran as quickly as I could up to my parents' room and grabbed my father's rifle. However, I didn't have the key to unlock the trigger lock or any of the ammunition. I figured I would pretend it was loaded and try to hide the lock with my hand. If I was attacked, I would use the buttstock to defend myself. All I thought of was getting my sister to safety. When I got to the basement door, I opened it quietly and walked down the steps, turning to face my sister's crib. No one was there, but she was still crying, as well as the baby monitor being on the ground sideways. I mustered all the courage I could and yelled, "I'm armed. Come out before I find you." Still nothing. I grabbed my sister and ran upstairs. I closed the basement door and pushed a chair under the handle to keep it locked while I called my parents. They called the police and got home as fast as they could. The police got to my house before my parents did, so they made me sit in the back of the cop car with my baby sister while one of the police officers went inside to investigate. When my parents arrived, I told them everything that happened. They were confused but very concerned. They knew I wasn't the type of kid that would lie about something like this. The police officer came out and gave us an all clear and said no one was in the house. Just as they finished talking to us and were about to leave, my dad worriedly asked them if they checked behind the bookshelf. In my room, there was a bookshelf that came embedded into the wall, so I was very confused when my dad asked to look behind it. The police officer was confused too, and asked my father to come inside with him and point out what he meant. Lo and behold, when we got downstairs, my bookshelf was pushed open slightly like a door, and the basement window that leads to the backyard was opened all the way, with my desk chair planted under it. Behind the bookshelf was a small room with some of the pipes to our house, and the pipes wrapped around some of the walls. On the ground were some food wrappers, one of our cups that had gone missing, lotion, a switchblade, along with an apple that was partially eaten but still slightly fresh. Someone had been living in our house, and we didn't even know it this whole time.
Wow.
They said that most likely while they were outside talking to us, whoever was here escaped through the open window. They said to call if we ever noticed anything suspicious. However, they didn't think the person would come back now that we knew of their secret. That wasn't even the most horrifying part, however. A few days later, I pushed open the bookshelf myself and explored it top to bottom. That's when I found a tiny hole in the wall, and when I looked through, it pointed directly to my bed and dresser. Whoever was in there was watching me sleep, get dressed, play my video games, do my homework, speak on the phone, everything. They knew most of my life. I'm an adult now, and I live in my own apartment with my boyfriend. My parents still live there 5 years later. To this day, I worry for them, and hope whoever that was never returns. This happened last year. I was 22 at the time, completely burnt out from work, and I was going through one of those stretches where everything in life felt like it was happening to someone else. I won't get into specifics, but let's just say I had a colorful past, and by that point, I was actively trying to put some distance between myself and certain chapters of my life. What I needed more than anything was to disappear for a few days. We've all been there. I must have been venting out loud because one day at work, I found myself having a conversation with a coworker about this tiny island off the coast of Maine. The way he described it, the place sounded almost aggressively boring. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark, and most people just took the ferry out for the day and left before sunset. He said if you stayed overnight, it was like having the whole island to yourself, which was exactly what I was looking for. I found a vacation rental listing for a standalone cottage right on the shoreline. The price was suspiciously cheap, and it was available on short notice, which probably should have raised some flags, but I wasn't exactly in a cautious headspace. I booked it without thinking twice. The cottage itself was small, just a single room with a bed, an unused kitchenette, and a bathroom the size of a closet. It was set back from the water, surrounded on 3 sides by thick brush that pressed right up against the walls. The front faced the ocean, with a single window covered by this thin, semi-translucent curtain that didn't do much to block the view in either direction. The walls were paper thin. I could hear the wind moving through the brush like it was right next to my ear. The door had a deadbolt and a chain lock that both looked like they'd been installed recently, which struck me as a little odd for such an isolated spot, but I didn't dwell on it. I took the late afternoon ferry over and spent the early evening just walking around the island. It was kind of surreal watching the place empty out as the day visitors filtered back to the mainland. By the time the sun went down, there was almost no one left. No streetlights, no ambient noise, nothing. I was pretty much left alone to enjoy the sounds of the ocean by myself. It was beautiful. I grabbed dinner at this little pub near the ferry landing. The bartender was friendly enough, but I noticed that she gave me a weird face when I told her where I was staying. I walked back. I passed a small dock tucked into a cave maybe 100 yards from the cottage. There was a single blue motorboat moored over there. It stood out because all the other boats I'd seen on the island were larger lobster vessels. I made a mental note of it, but didn't think too much beyond that. I got back to the cottage around 10:30, locked the deadbolt and the chain, and settled in for the night. Up until that point, I was really enjoying the time away from everything. But of course, that peace didn't last. I realized my phone charger was busted, or maybe it was the outlet I was using. But the point is, my phone wouldn't charge no matter what I tried. I tried every outlet in the cottage. My phone was on low battery, and I was 100% sure it was going to die within the hour. Luckily, I didn't really need it to get back to the ferry. I had a physical ticket, but no one likes having a dead phone. I decided to just call it a night and go to sleep. I was exhausted anyway, and I did fall asleep pretty quickly actually. The exhaustion from the past few nights hit me all at once, and I was out within a few minutes of my head hitting the pillow. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I don't know what pulled me out of my sleep exactly, but once I was awake, I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside the cottage. They were close, right in front of the door, and whoever was out there was taking their time, which I could tell because there was a long pause in between each step. It definitely didn't sound like an animal scurrying around. I shifted in bed just slightly, and the footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't really describe. It stretched on long enough that I started to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or that it really had just been an animal. I didn't want to move, so I just stared at the ceiling in that same position. I'm not sure what I was waiting for, but I was so freaked out that I couldn't even think straight. And a few minutes later, the footsteps came back. This time there was no mistaking the direction. They weren't passing by, they were approaching. I heard them come right up to the entrance of the cottage and stopped directly in front of the door. At that point, my heart was damn near pounding out of my chest. I felt like they could hear it, but there was nothing I could do besides try and be as silent as possible. As if the situation wasn't bad enough, whoever was out there turned on a flashlight and tried shining it through the front door. I couldn't move because I was petrified in fear. That person clicked off the light and tried the door handle. I shut my eyes and prayed the deadbolt would hold, and it did. I thought that would be enough of a deterrent, but I was wrong. A few seconds passed, and then they tried again, putting more weight into it this time. Then came several hard bangs, one after another. The sound was so loud in that tiny little cottage that I actually flinched with each impact. The bangs activated my brain though. The threat was more real, and even though I was still terrified, I knew I had to do something. So without thinking, I jumped out of bed while that person was still banging on the door and crouched down behind it. I was fully prepared for what was about to happen, but instead of that person bursting through the door, everything went quiet. I stayed crouched down for a few seconds, trying not to breathe too loudly. And then, and I still remember this vividly, whoever was on the other side of the door spoke. "I know you're in there, Leo." I almost yelled out in shock, but I stopped myself. It was a man's voice, one I didn't recognize, but he somehow knew my name. He knew I was there. The footsteps moved away from the door and along the side of the cottage. I tracked the sound as it passed the bathroom wall and continued around. He was taunting me. He knew I was in there. My confidence was gone. Hearing my own name was enough to make me dizzy. It was the scariest moment of my entire life. Over the next stretch of time, I have no idea how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, whoever was outside circled the cottage. I had no idea what they were doing, and a part of me was screaming for them to just break down the door and get it over with already. Eventually, the footsteps receded from the cottage. Then, from the direction of the dock, I heard an engine start. It was the unmistakable sound of a small outboard motor. I listened as it pulled away from the shore and faded into the distance across open water. I didn't sleep after that. That's not an exaggeration. I stayed awake the entire night. The second it was bright enough to see, I was out the door. The gravel around the cottage told the whole story. There were heavy boot prints circling the cottage multiple times. The prints led in a straight line from the cottage toward the dock and ended right at the waterline. The next day was honestly a blur. I returned the key to the property owner, boarded a ferry, and made it home. But I was not in a good headspace. Here's the thing that still gets me. Whoever was outside that cottage didn't come from the island. They came by boat, specifically to that cottage, and on that specific night. They knew my name and exactly where I'd be. The thing is, I have absolutely no idea how they could have tracked me down. I confronted my coworker about it a few days later, the one who told me about that island in the first place, and he swore up and down he hadn't told anyone about my trip. And honestly, I believed him. He looked genuinely freaked out when I told him what happened. I mentioned earlier that I have a colorful past. I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just say, I'm not exactly shocked that someone out there might want to find me. What I still can't wrap my head around is, how did someone track me to some random island off the coast of Maine? How did they know which rental I'd booked, and on which night? How long had they been watching me before any of this? I don't have any answers to any of those questions, and the worst part is, I still work the same job and live in the same place. Nothing has changed since then, but I have no reason to believe things are over. This happened many, many years ago. I'm a structural engineer, and at the time I was finishing up my graduate thesis on concrete degradation in marine environments. It was very boring, but it's what got me invited to Japan. This is all relevant, by the way. I was in Nagasaki for an academic conference. There was this professor I'd been corresponding with who had done extensive research on post-industrial decay. His name was Dr. Yamamoto, and he pulled some strings and arranged something I never thought I'd get access to, a research permit for Hashima Island. If you don't know Hashima, you've probably seen pictures of it without realizing. It's this tiny island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks like a battleship, completely covered in crumbling concrete apartment blocks. It used to be a coal mining operation, one of the most densely populated places on Earth at its peak. They abandoned it in the 70s when the coal ran out, and it's been rotting ever since. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Tourists can technically visit, but only on guided tours that stick to a narrow concrete path along the seawall. Civilians are expressly forbidden from entering the actual buildings due to structural integrity concerns. But I wasn't subject to the same restrictions, of course, which was thrilling and a little scary. I had to sign an exhaustive stack of papers, basically waiving my right to damages should I injure myself or something. The morning of the visit, I took an early ferry from Nagasaki. It wasn't a tourist boat, but rather a smaller vessel arranged through the research office. It was just me and my escort, a guy named Takeshi. He didn't talk much. I didn't really mind because I was so hyped about the excursion. The approach to Hashima plays tricks on your eyes. When it first appears within your line of sight, it looks deceptively small, insignificant almost. But then, as you get closer, the scale of it hits you. The seawall wrapping around the entire island, the apartment blocks stacked on top of each other. It really is something else. I had seen hundreds of photos, but none of them prepared me for actually laying my eyes on what I can only describe as a true wonder. Takeshi gave me the briefing on the dock. I had access to several buildings beyond the normal tour route. He actually had a list. But there were still rules, such as stay on designated paths, don't enter anything marked with red tape, don't remove anything, don't touch anything you don't need to, and stay within visual range of him at all times. He said that last part twice. I also had to wear a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and these bulky reinforced work pants that made it a little difficult to walk. Despite all the excess gear, the first couple hours were amazing. I was taking photos, taking notes, completely in my element. Takeshi followed at a distance, occasionally glancing at his watch. He clearly wanted this over with. We entered one of the large residential blocks around midday. The stairs were intact, but barely. You could see daylight through the gaps in the landing. Takeshi waited on the ground floor while I went up, which I thought was a little strange given his whole stay within visual range speech, but I wasn't going to argue. It was kind of irritating having him follow me around anyway. I was on the 4th floor examining a section of wall where the concrete had completely separated from the rebar underneath when I noticed something off. The dust patterns were wrong. There was dust everywhere, obviously decades of it, but there was this path through it, like someone had been walking this route regularly. Not recently maybe, but often enough that the dust hadn't fully settled back. I followed it with my eye and realized it led to a room at the end of the corridor. I should have gone back down to tell Takeshi, which would have been the smart thing, but I was curious and wanted to check things out for myself. He probably would have just ushered me back downstairs anyway, depriving me of ever getting an answer, so I carefully walked over to the room and pushed the door open. I immediately noticed two things, both of which were incredibly unsettling. Firstly, there was this weird smell emanating from the room that I didn't recognize. It didn't really smell like anything natural, but I couldn't recognize it as any kind of human smell either. I know that makes no sense, but that specific smell was genuinely something I have never encountered before. The second thing was even more confusing. The wall I touched was hot, or at least noticeably warmer than any of the other surfaces I'd felt on the island. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process it. You might be thinking the warmth was probably due to sun exposure, and yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's what I was thinking too, even though there weren't any gaps in the ceiling. And I figured the smell could have been animals, even though I wasn't aware that any animals even lived on Hashima. I went back down and mentioned it to Takeshi. His reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't ask me any clarifying questions or even seem that concerned. He just told me that what I saw was impossible, and that no humans or animals lived on the island. He didn't even ask me to take him to that room. When I insisted that he follow me so I could show him the smell for himself, he flatly refused. His reaction was really disturbing, to be quite honest. We continued the tour, and I started being much more observant every time he allowed me to enter a building. I kept noticing weird things, nothing fully revealing like clothes or anything like that, but weird markings and signs that something had been there. I say something because I didn't know whether I was seeing signs of a person or signs of an animal, which was the most confusing part. At one point, I mentioned more of these sightings to Takeshi, and this time he didn't even respond. Instead, he just pulled out his radio and spoke rapid Japanese into it. I had no idea what he was saying or who he was even talking to, but it was the first time he had used the radio since we got off the boat. When I asked him what he said, he told me he was checking the schedule. I obviously didn't believe him, but what was I supposed to do? Demand that he tell me what he said? I just ignored him, but I was significantly more unsettled after that. It was almost like he knew what was going on and just didn't want to tell me. We reached a taller residential block near the center of the island. Takeshi hesitated at the entrance. He actually stopped walking and stood there for a few seconds before following me in. I remember thinking that was weird. He'd been bored and impatient all morning, and now he was all attentive? But I didn't care. I wasn't going to let someone else's attitude stop me from exploring. The stairwell was narrow and dark, but structurally sound. We went up maybe 5 floors. Takeshi was right behind me the whole time, which felt like a change from his earlier indifference. And then, after walking into one of the corner rooms up there, I saw something that immediately validated all my previous concerns. Against one of the walls was a pile of blankets and a few empty bottles of water. There was no mistake about it this time. I was looking at definitive evidence of human habitation. I regained my composure after the initial shock and turned to show Takeshi. There was no way I was going to allow him to dismiss my claims this time, but when I stepped out of the room, he was gone. I don't know why, but seeing those items in that room didn't terrify me until I realized I was alone up there. It was like Takeshi having disappeared unlocked my brain, and only then was I able to process how scary the situation truly was. There was someone else on that island. I suddenly felt a very acute urge to strip out of my gear and scratch myself. My whole body was itching, and I was starting to freak out. I frantically made my way back to the stairwell we'd come up, thinking I'd just run down and end the trip short. But no, as if things weren't bad enough, I turned the corner and realized the stairs were blocked. There was a pile of rubble spilled across the landing, enough that I couldn't get through. I didn't have time to think about whether it had collapsed naturally or whether someone had piled it there purposefully. I just turned and ran. I ran past that room and down the corridor, praying that there was another stairwell somewhere close by. I didn't care about the structural damage anymore. I was so scared and didn't care about anything other than getting the hell out of there. As I was sprinting down the hall, I heard movement from somewhere behind me. It sounded like footsteps stepping out into the hallway. I didn't turn around, no chance in hell. I just kept running. The only problem was that it was like a maze in there. I was too scared to think straight, and I felt like I was running in circles. The whole time I could hear footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was Takeshi, but after a while I realized there were multiple sets of footsteps, which meant I was being followed by multiple people. I finally found another stairwell, and I practically jumped down it. I don't remember much about getting out of the building. I remember sprinting across open ground and then the dock. Takeshi was just standing there by the boat. Seeing how unfazed he looked took me from scared to downright angry. I started screaming at him about what I had seen, about the people in that building, about him abandoning me, everything. I think I even accused him of piling that rubble up in an attempt to strand me in there. He barely even blinked. It was like he wasn't hearing what I was saying. I wanted to put my hands on him, but that would have been a terrible idea. He was my way off the island. He had all the power. I had none. The way he didn't even react to what I was saying only made me angrier. At one point, I actually kind of hoped that whoever had been stalking me in that building would turn a corner so Takeshi would believe me. He waited for me to finally calm down, and then instead of acknowledging anything I had said, he just said we were leaving. I didn't know what to think. I was still pretty unsettled and scared at what had just happened, but I was also horrified that this guy was refusing to acknowledge any of it. It genuinely made me think that he knew something about what had happened. Or worse, maybe he had caused it himself. Maybe he had been the one to pile that rubble. But the worst part was that I had to sit through an entire ferry ride back to the mainland with him. I was genuinely worried for my safety, but we made it back, and that was that. As soon as I got somewhere safe, the first thing I wanted to do was report my sightings. That there were people on Hashima. That was extremely concerning. So I contacted the only person I could think to contact. The only person who had any connection to both me and the island. Dr. Yamamoto. But I couldn't get a hold of him. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back in the US at that point, and I still couldn't get a hold of him. It was like he had disappeared. I tried my best to report what I had seen to the relevant authorities, but I don't think anything came of it. I don't think anyone believed me. It's been years and years and years since this all happened, but this is a story I'll tell anyone who will listen. Strangely, the thing that gets to me the most isn't what happened on the island, but what happened after. The fact that I couldn't get in contact with Dr. Yamamoto, despite him going to great lengths to arrange my visit to the island. The thing I regret the most is not taking more action to get to the bottom of what was going on there. If I had spoken Japanese, or if I didn't have to return to the US so quickly, I might have been able to do something. This is something I'm gonna think about forever. This happened a long time ago. I'm talking 10 plus years. It was during my very last semester of college. I was majoring in history, and I was deep into my senior thesis, which focused on abandoned institutional spaces, places like defunct hospitals, asylums, rehab centers, especially ones that still existed in or around major cities. One of the cases I was writing about was North Brother Island. It was this overgrown island right in the East River, technically part of New York City, but it had been completely abandoned for decades.
Oh yeah.
I know it's still exactly the same, but I haven't been in New York City in forever, so I really wouldn't know. Here's a very abbreviated history. It used to house a quarantine hospital, then a rehab center, and then at some point in the distant past it became off limits to the public. Unless something's changed, you still need a permit to even set foot there. In fact, it's probably even more heavily guarded considering how seriously the US takes security and whatnot these days. That's all you really need to know about it, but for any fellow history buffs out there, feel free to do your own research. You might even find my thesis. I never actually planned on going, that would have been illegal, but I mentioned it offhand one night to two of my friends, Jansen and Jesse, while we were drinking. I was probably pissed at how long it was taking, knowing how lazy and unproductive I was back then. Surprisingly, they both thought my thesis sounded really interesting, despite the fact that neither of them were history majors. So I told them some of the interesting tidbits about the various places I was researching. The moment they realized one of the places was quite literally tucked away in the very city we were sitting in, they were hooked. Jansen and Jesse, and I guess myself by extension, were really into that whole urban exploring, edgy vibe back then. Back then, it was decently popular among young guys at the time. They both thought it sounded like the perfect target for an urban exploration trip, and I'll admit, after all the research I'd done, I was curious too. Not in a ghost hunter way or anything, but more like, if I was going to describe the place in my thesis, why not actually see it with my own eyes? Fast forward a few weeks, and that's how we found ourselves sneaking through Barretto Point Park in the Bronx at 2 a.m. with 3 solo kayaks in tow. It was one of the few spots along the shoreline where you could launch without attracting too much attention, and it was only about a half-mile paddle to the island. We had a bunch of supplies, probably more than we needed, but we figured we'd play it safe. The plan was to leave around 2:30, explore the island for a few hours while it was still dark, and be back before sunrise. It felt stupid and thrilling at the same time, the best kind of fun. Getting our kayaks into the water was surprisingly seamless. I guess I hadn't anticipated how deserted the park was going to be at that time of night. But as soon as we started paddling toward the island, the reality of what we were doing began setting in. There wasn't anything stopping us anymore. All we had to do was paddle at that point, and a bit of nervousness started creeping into what had just moments earlier been pure excitement. Regardless, we made it to the island. Pulling the kayaks onto shore was a bit of a struggle because of all the overgrowth. We had to push through some tall reeds and weeds just to find a somewhat stable spot to leave them. Once we were on solid ground, the three of us just kind of stood there for a second, taking it all in. It was dark, obviously, but we had flashlights, and the moon was bright enough that you could make out the general shapes of things. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it all was. I know that sounds cliche, but you have to understand, we were technically still in New York City. The Bronx was right there, maybe half a mile away, and yet it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. We started walking inland. It didn't take long for Jansen and Jesse to realize just how big the island actually was. I had told them beforehand that it wasn't some tiny little rock. I think I even showed them a map at some point, but they clearly hadn't internalized it. As we made our way deeper, we started passing building after building. Most of them partially collapsed or so overgrown that you could barely tell they were buildings at all. At one point, Jesse stopped and just stared at this one structure that had a tree literally splitting it in half. He said it looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic video game, like one of the ones where you're scavenging through the ruins of civilization. He wasn't wrong, that's exactly what it felt like. There was something almost alien about the way nature had reclaimed everything, like the island was actively trying to swallow any evidence that humans had ever been there. I remember thinking that if I didn't know better, I'd assume the place had been empty for centuries, not decades. We explored a few of the more intact buildings, shining our flashlights into rooms that hadn't seen visitors in God knows how long. Most of them were empty, but in one of the larger buildings, Jansen found something on the ground near a doorway, a half-empty can of spray paint. He immediately wanted to use it, and Jesse was on board. I told them no, that it felt disrespectful, not just to the buildings, but to the history of the place. People had lived there and people had died there, but they pointed out that there was already graffiti all over the walls, some of it pretty elaborate, and argued that a little more wasn't going to make a difference. I didn't have the energy to keep fighting about it, so I told them I wasn't going to stop them, but I wasn't going to stick around and watch either. In hindsight, wandering off was probably a mistake. I made my way through a few more rooms, trying to take mental notes for my thesis, but the further I got from Jansen and Jesse, the more unsettling everything became. It's hard to explain unless you've been in a situation like that. When you're with other people, even in a creepy place, there's a buffer. You can tell yourself it's fine because nothing bad would happen with witnesses around or whatever. But being alone is a completely different story. I was walking down a long hallway in one of the larger buildings. I think it might have been part of the old hospital complex, when I heard Jesse's voice call my name from somewhere ahead of me, from one of the rooms further down the hall. The sound of it made me jump, and even though I knew it was him, I was still pretty freaked out. I started walking toward it, and something began to feel off. For Jesse to be ahead of me, he would have had to take a completely different route through the building. That wasn't impossible. There were multiple hallways and stairways, but it would have meant he left Jansen almost immediately after I did, and then speed walked or even ran just to loop around and end up in front of me. That didn't make any sense. Why would he do that? There were too many rooms branching off from the hallway, and I couldn't tell exactly which one the voice had come from, so I called out to him, asking where he was. I got a response almost immediately from a room just a few doors down on my left. It was definitely Jansen's voice, and all he said was, "In here." I walked toward it. The doorway was dark, darker than the hallway, which was already pretty dark, and I couldn't see anything inside. I figured Jesse and Jansen were probably just messing with me, trying to scare me for wandering off, which is exactly the kind of thing Jansen would think was hilarious. I stepped into the room without really thinking about it, and swept my flashlight around the room. It landed on a figure standing in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. For a split second, my brain tried to convince me it was one of my friends, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. Whoever this was, they were really tall, easily 6.5 feet, maybe more. Neither Jansen nor
Bye-bye.
Jesse were anywhere close to that height. I can't express how scary seeing that figure was. I screamed. I couldn't help myself. I ran out of that room as fast as I could. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I was yelling for Jansen and Jesse to run as loudly as I could. I've never been more scared in my life. I felt like whoever had been in that room was going to catch me, or something else would jump out from one of the many pitch-black rooms I was running past. I found my friends near where we'd originally split up. When they saw me sprinting toward them, they just started running too. We didn't stop until we reached the kayaks. Once we caught our breath, I told them everything. They didn't believe me at first, which I completely understood. If Jansen had told me the same story, I would have assumed he was messing with me. But I pleaded with them to believe me, that I wasn't making it up, and after a minute or so, they actually started to look more scared than me. We decided to just leave. Whatever we'd come to see, it wasn't worth sticking around after that. But right as we started dragging the kayaks back toward the water, all three of us heard it at the same time. It was faint but distinct. A moaning sound coming from somewhere in the darkness behind us. It sounded like a woman, an older woman, either crying or wincing in pain. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough that we could hear it clearly if we focused. None of us said anything, but I could tell Jesse and Jansen were losing it. I was too. My hands were shaking. We finally got the kayaks into the water. The paddle back felt like it took forever, but we made it. The whole drive, none of us could stop talking about what happened. We went over every detail, trying to make sense of it, trying to come up with some rational explanation. But the thing I kept coming back to, the thing that freaked me out the most, was the voice. Because that was definitely Jesse's voice I heard in that hallway. I know Jesse's voice as well as I know my own, and whatever called out to me sounded exactly like him. Except Jesse was nowhere near that part of the building. He was with Jansen the whole time. I've thought about going back to the island over the years, but I never have. For one thing, I'm pretty sure it's basically impossible now. From what I've read, they've really cracked down on unauthorized access. Even if I wanted to, I don't think I could get within 100 yards of that place without getting intercepted by someone. I really don't believe in the paranormal, I never have, but I have a hard time explaining what happened that night any other way. Someone was on that island with us, someone who knew my name, Someone who could make their voice sound exactly like Jesse's. I don't think I'll ever get an answer to what happened that night.
Mm.
When I was a kid, the attic always scared me more than the basement did. I don't really know why. Most people are more afraid of basements, but there was something about our attic that really got to me. If I had to guess, I'd say it was because our attic was slightly unconventional compared to what you're probably picturing. For starters, it was surprisingly spacious. Most attics are typically cramped and congested, which makes sense, but our attic was built in such a way that you didn't ever have to crouch when you were up there. You might think that would imply we used it more often, the same way anyone would use excess space. But no, I'm not really sure why, but my parents treated it like a glorified storage room. That was its sole purpose. Thinking about it now, they honestly avoided it as much as possible. The other thing about it was that it had so many nooks and crannies built into it. What I mean by that is the space was broken up by odd beams and small changes in elevation, almost like a makeshift maze. The beams were of uneven thickness, and there was no pattern to where they appeared. The result was that you couldn't stand in any one place up there and have a clear line of sight from one end to the other, and the uneven flooring was a nightmare. You could genuinely injure yourself up there if you weren't careful. My dad used to joke that one day one of us would slip on one of the joists, fall through the insulation, and puncture a hole in the ceiling. So you can imagine why an attic like that would be scary to a little kid. The maze-like quality was what freaked me out the most. I really didn't like not being able to see the attic in its entirety, and every time I went up there, I felt like someone was hiding behind one of the beams. But anyway, what I'm about to tell you happened so long ago that I don't have a ton of other memories from that period in my life. For whatever reason, however, this memory is so vivid that it feels like a thorn protruding into what was otherwise a fantastic childhood. It happened during the week, which I remember because I had school that day. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but I was in middle school. I woke up one morning and noticed my feet were dirty. The bottoms were gray and grimy, and there was this fine layer of grit between my toes that I couldn't explain. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at them, trying to figure out what had happened. I hadn't gone outside the night before. I hadn't done anything unusual. I'd just gone to bed, fallen asleep, and woken up with filthy feet. Being a little kid and all, I didn't give it too much thought beyond that. I just washed my feet in the bathtub and went about my day.
Things only escalated from there, though. A few days later, I found a box in my room that didn't belong there. It was the small cardboard box filled with old photographs, the kind my parents kept stored away in the attic. I had no memory of bringing it downstairs, and when I asked my mom about it, she just assumed I'd been rummaging through the attic for some reason. I told her I hadn't, but she didn't seem concerned. She just took the box back upstairs, and that was that. Then it happened again. I woke up one morning and found an old lamp sitting on my desk. This ugly brass thing that I vaguely recognized from the attic. This time I was sure I definitely hadn't brought that down. I would have remembered carrying a lamp through my house in the middle of the night. But there it was, sitting on my desk like it belonged there. That's when things started clicking into place. The dirty feet, the box of photographs, the lamp. I wasn't just sleepwalking. I was sleepwalking to the attic. The realization didn't scare me right away, but it made me feel strange. The idea that I was unconsciously navigating that maze of beams and uneven flooring in the dark, completely unaware of what I was doing, was weird. I told my parents, and they reacted exactly how you'd expect. They said sleepwalking was completely normal, that lots of kids did it, and that I'd probably grow out of it. I wouldn't exactly say they were dismissive, but they weren't overly concerned either. To them, it was just one of those things. But to me, it was more than that. After the next incident, I started dreading bedtime. I'd lie in bed for hours after I was supposed to go to sleep, fighting it because I was terrified of what might happen once I was unconscious. I obviously couldn't fight sleep forever, though, and every morning, I would frantically check my feet to see if they were dirty. If they were clean, it had been a good night. If they were dirty, it had been a bad night. They were usually clean, but those few times they weren't really got to me. There was no denying that I was definitely going up to the attic regularly, and the worst part about the whole thing was that I had no memory of it whatsoever. For all I knew, I was spending more time up there than in my own bed. The fear I felt during that period was different from anything I had ever experienced. It was like this slow, creeping dread that never went away. It was awful, but nothing was scarier than what I'm about to say. I woke up one morning, only it wasn't morning. It was still dark out. It took me a few seconds to realize it, but I wasn't in my bed either. In fact, I wasn't even lying down. I was standing. That was the first thing I registered. I was standing upright in complete darkness, and I had no idea where I was. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't even process it. Recognition hit me. I was in the attic. The fear that washed over me was so intense that I almost couldn't breathe. I was in the attic in the middle of the night in pitch black darkness. I couldn't see a single thing, not the beams, not the boxes, not the hatch, nothing. Just absolute impenetrable black. And to make matters worse, I had no idea where in the attic I was. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. It was like sleep paralysis times 100. I knew the layout of the attic, but only vaguely, and only from memory. I also knew there were obstacles everywhere. The idea of trying to find my way back to the hatch in complete darkness was almost unthinkable, but I couldn't just stand there forever. So I started moving, slowly and painfully. I was so scared that I actually started crying, but silently. The tears were just flooding down my face, and I felt like if I made too much noise, something was going to get me. It was the most terrified I've ever been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. I don't know what was giving me that thought, but I could feel something else there with me. Something further in the dark, and as soon as I had that thought, I actually heard something. There was a soft thud from somewhere behind me. It honestly sounded like a footstep, or someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I kept moving, but I heard the sound twice more, and both times it sounded like it was coming from a different spot. At that point, I was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was something else up there with me. I don't know how long it took me to find the hatch, but I eventually did find it. I went straight to my parents' room and woke them up. I was full on bawling at that point. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told them what had happened, how I'd had to find my way back in the dark. I told them about the sounds too, and that there was someone in the attic. I expected my dad to spring out of bed and rush up there with a baseball bat, but he didn't. They didn't even really take me seriously. My mom just hugged me and told me it was okay, that sleepwalking could be scary, but it wasn't dangerous. My dad offered to put a lock on the attic hatch if it would make me feel better, and I said yes, obviously. But I knew what I heard. I insisted that they at least check the attic, and my dad finally agreed. As I was watching my dad climb up there was a part of me that genuinely thought he wasn't going to make it back. But not 2 minutes later, he was already climbing back down the ladder. He told me there was nothing up there and to go back to sleep. So that's what I did, but lying in bed after that experience was the worst night of my life. After that, the sleepwalking did stop. I'm not sure what I would have done if it had continued. And speaking of that, I've never been able to fully accept the sleepwalking explanation. I know that's the most logical explanation. Sleepwalking is a real thing that happens to people, and there's nothing supernatural about it. But there's this part of me that can't...
I don't know how the hell I'm gonna do this scratchy part, bro.
The attic, never anywhere else in the house. And the way I was apparently capable of navigating the maze of beams and obstacles in complete darkness without even hurting myself. And most of all, that night I woke up standing in the dark. The sounds I heard. I still believe there was something up there with me. I really do. What it was, I have no idea. I'm obviously a lot older now, and I've brought these concerns up to my parents several times, but they always give me the same dismissive answers. It almost feels like they themselves don't want to think about it, which also doesn't make much sense to me. I doubt I'll ever get the answer I'm looking for.
Alright, guys, I'm gonna end it here.
This happened in 2015.
Thank you for watching the stream. Hope you guys have a good rest of the day or night. Appreciate you. Bye now, Johnny.